This is a video to talk about early Christian art and architecture. And to talk about the art and the architecture first, we need to explain a little bit about what's happening historically. And the most important thing for us to understand as we're moving into this period historically is the transition into the actual Christian world, hence the name early Christian art. And the person who's the most influential in that at this moment in history is Constantine. It's probably a name you've heard before. He's very well known. Constantine was a member of the Tetrarchy that we discussed in class before. And remember, the Tetrarchy was meant to reintroduce a sense of stability into the Roman government. Ultimately, it was not successful, though, and Constantine ends up battling some of his fellow tetrarchs for power of Rome. It really comes to a crux here with the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Constantine has an incredible victory at that Battle of Milvian Bridge, which leads him into the role of the Roman emperor. So it's significant for that reason. But it's even more significant in terms of what we're talking about here with Christianity, because Constantine credited the Christian God with influencing his troops and helping him achieve the victory at this battle. Here's the legend. Constantine in the afternoon, before the battle is fought, sees a kind of vision in the heavens. He sees the Chi in the sky. It's like an X with a P superimposed over the top. And he also sees by this conquer. So he takes it to mean that this Chi, which stands for the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek and was a really common symbol used at the time period for Christ. This symbol was a mark that if he was going to fight this battle under the mark of Christianity, then he would win. In the night, he has kind of a second dream that supports his earlier vision, and in the morning, they wake up. He has his troops paint the Chi on their shields, and they go to battle. And as we've already mentioned, they're ultimately successful. So not only is this an important political battle because it's the battle in which Constantine really can claim to be the Roman emperor, it's also an important battle because Constantine acknowledges that the Christian God had a role to play in that victory. And this is going to lead to Constantine in the next year, in 313 CE, legalizing Christianity with what is known as the Edict of Milan. This officially ends the persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. And there had been points historically when Christians had been heavily prosecuted and persecuted, rather, for many different reasons, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So this is a really important battle for us. Now, after the legalization of Christianity, we see a pretty solid increase in Christian converts. And a few years down the road, Constantine's going to gather together what's known as the Council of Nicaea, and that's going to happen in 325 CE. And after that council, paganism really tanks, and Christianity has a huge increase in its converts. The Council of Nicaea was called by Constantine. What happened at this council was that a number of influential Christian leaders and teachers gathered together, and they were meant during this series of meetings to come to an agreement as to what Christian doctrine really was. At this point, just as it is true today, there are lots of different kind of flavors of Christianity. Ultimately, they shared many of the same beliefs, but there were slight variations in between these different flavors, so to speak. The Council of Nicaea was meant to bring more harmony between all of the ideas and bring a greater sense of unity to Christians on the whole. And of course, that is meant to bring a greater sense of unity to Rome. So as we said, after this council, an incredible number of converts, and by the time we get to 391 CE, Christianity will be the official religion of the Roman Empire. Paganism will essentially be outlawed and banned. So it's a real quick turnaround. Less than 100 years, Christianity has switched from a heavily persecuted minority group to the dominant and predominant religious group in the Roman Empire. So if we're talking about this in terms of the exam, you for sure would want to bring up this transition into the legalization of Christianity, because it has quite a few impacts on art, which we'll talk about in just a moment. You should also spend some time talking about how the persecution of Christians before that legalization impacted what kinds of arts were created. You're looking here at a mosaic from the 3rd century CE, and it's showing a Christian being tortured by some animals. It's pretty horrific. But why were the Christians looked upon with such disfavor by the Romans? There were a few things in Christian teaching that were very difficult for the Romans to handle and to stomach. First thing, we've talked continually about the Romans being a very classed society, where your status and your lineage and your heritage was very important. Christians taught that anyone, regardless of your class, lineage, or heritage, anyone could be saved, anyone could be redeemed. And so the Romans, in their kind of snobbery, really weren't comfortable with that, really didn't like that. Going along with that same notion, many of the early Christians came from the poorer classes, and they did not come from the wealthy upper classes. And because those Romans are snobby about class, that also kind of made them look on Christianity in disfavor. Another thing that was really difficult for the Romans to accept, and that they thought was inappropriate for a religion, was the fact that in Christianity, their God inhabited a mortal body. So for many Christian sects, and as true for most of Christianity at this point in time, God and Christ were the same person, different manifestations of the same person. So when Christ came to the earth and was crucified and died, that was the same thing as God coming to earth and being killed. And so he had a mortal body. And the Romans felt like that was really just inappropriate for a figure of religious significance. So that's another problem that they had. One of the things, though, that's probably the most significant in terms of helping us to understand why the Romans disliked Christianity is this last set of words here we have in this group, which that Christianity weakens imperial power. We've spent quite a bit of time talking about how church and state are closely linked in the Roman Empire, and understanding that the church was in support of the state, and understanding that many religious rites and ceremonies were performed in order to ensure the success of the Roman armies, and understanding that many of those Roman emperors claimed to be divinely sanctioned or even divinely descended themselves. Many of those Roman emperors claimed to be apotheosized upon their death, right? They became gods. Understanding all of those elements really helps us to understand how Christians and their refusal to partake in the same set of beliefs, to participate in these religious rituals, and to accept the whole notion that the emperor was going to become a god, you can see how that would be problematic and how really that is a threat to the Roman government and to the Roman state. So these Christians and their refusal to believe what the Romans were telling them in terms of religious belief, and their refusal to participate in some of these religious ceremonies that were meant to ensure military success, all of that was seen as a way to try and weaken the Roman government. So because of these reasons, all of which you would want to talk about on an essay exam when you're talking about early Christians, would be reasons why the Romans really looked on Christianity in the first few centuries as something that was distasteful and kind of subpar. Now, as we said, this really changes with the Edict of Milan in 313, and especially with that Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Now, what we have talked about already, and just as a reminder, remember those Christians, as many of them were lower class, the lower classes and the Christians in the Roman Empire had a preference for a style that was less classical overall. We talked about that quite a bit when we were explaining that transition from the imperial period into the late imperial period and why artistic styles begin to change as they're trying to reach a broader audience with their artworks. Part of that audience was the fringe areas of the Roman Empire, like we discussed. Also, the lower classes and the Christians. All of these types of people, for the most part, preferred a non-classical style. And so when we see these very early types of Christian artworks, we're usually seeing something that's pretty non-classical in its appearance. Another thing to kind of set up historically, just to help you understand some of this background, is to talk about the shift in political power away from Rome and away from Italy and over towards the east with the establishment of Constantinople. So Constantine decides to build this new city in Constantinople. It's modern-day Istanbul. He felt like this was a more advantageous location in terms of centrality in the empire, in terms of its position along trade routes, and a number of other factors. So he builds this city of Constantinople, and it's just the beginning kind of the end of the importance of Rome as a city and the importance of the Italian peninsula. Over the next few centuries, their prominence will never be as significant as they once were, and it really won't be regained until we're getting close to the Renaissance for the most part. So Constantinople becomes the new capital. What's important for us to know is that, yes, in the West, the Roman Empire falls, and the official date of that is 476 CE. But even though the Roman Empire falls in the West, the Roman Empire continues in the East. It's centered in Constantinople. And although its power is just going to be kind of continually waning until it's eventually overturned in the 15th century, it is still a continuation of the classical world in many ways. And we call this the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines are going to continue classical languages, classical forms of art, classical emphasis on education. All of that will continue in the Byzantine Empire until it falls to the Turks in 1453.